Hey there, welcome to the Posit Data Science Hangout. I'm Libby Heron, and this is a recording of our weekly community call that happens every Thursday at 12 p.m. US Eastern Time. If you are not joining us live, you miss out on the amazing chat that's going on. So find the link in the description where you can add our call to your calendar and come hang out with the most supportive, friendly, and funny data community you'll ever experience. Can't wait to see you there. Okay, I'm so excited to introduce our featured leader today, Martin Frigaard. Martin is a senior Shiny application developer, and he's here to tell us all about his experience as a Shiny app developer and his journey. So get ready for all the questions about all things Shiny. Martin, would you introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about what you do and something you like to do for fun, and I'll remind you about that last part.
Okay, great. Yeah, so I'm Martin Frigaard. I just want to say, first off, I'm appearing on the Hangout as myself. All the views and opinions are my own and do not represent those of my employer. That being said, I'm an R programmer and Shiny developer. What I do for fun, it sounds like a distant memory. I have two small children now, so most of what I do for fun involves what they want to do for fun. But before that, I was a pretty avid. I spent a lot of time in my 20s and 30s doing. I did various I did a fair amount of Brazilian jiu-jitsu. I did a little bit of weightlifting and some other kind of gym oriented stuff, and then I did for a small period of time. I like to consider myself an amateur journalist, so I spent a fair amount of time kind of in the journalism world. In fact, my first kind of start with R was writing for Northeastern University's journalism school had Story Match was their blog. So my first kind of like R tutorials way back in like 2015 or 16 was writing for a journalism school. So I still mostly just now write. I write things to myself. It seems like more and more. No, they start out as little notes and turn into long essays where I'm like lecturing myself on advice that I don't take.
Well, we have a question that we can jump in and ask right away to get us started. Um, a great a great entry point for us. I see an asterisk, so I'm going to ask this for him. And it is from Nathan, who says, "How does one become a Shiny developer? I did not know that was a job title. That's so cool."
It wasn't. I think it was like broadly app developer, but now I will actually have recruiters, and you'll see them list Shiny app developer because it's obviously become big enough to become its own thing. I think that the path is probably is going to be more R programming. Um, I'd really recommend spending some time with a little bit of time in package development. So kind of once you get started with the basics of R and syntax, a little bit of knowledge on package development will make you a better Shiny app developer. And then yeah, if you're just getting started, I would really try to be as bilingual as possible between Shiny for Python and regular Shiny. I really like everything. Every time I pick up Shiny for Python, I'm impressed at the things it can do. And it seems like the crossover between the two, you would kind of want some of that flexibility.
I think that the package versus Shiny app distinction is not clear for a lot of people about why that's important. A lot of Shiny apps are actually developed as packages. Could you talk a little bit about your experience with that?
Yeah, that's why I wrote a book called Shiny App Packages. It's so there's a
Wait,
phenomenal
that
book.
I didn't know that, everybody. That was a great
Yeah.
segue.
Yeah, I mean, we can drop the link in the chat. If you just Google, I think, like my last name and Shiny App Packages, probably PKGS, you'll find it. It so when I started writing the book, there was a lot of questions, and when I was at the time I was working in the biotech pharma space, and there was a lot of adoption of Shiny and questions about should we use Golem, should we use so these frameworks were released, and Golem is a fantastic framework, out of the ThinkR group. They have a book that really walks you through. I think it's in engineering production grade Shiny apps. It's probably similar, but it's a really steep curve for package development. So there's a great book also adequately or aptly called Our Packages. I think it's on its third edition now. That's a great overview of how to develop your R code into a package. The R reference manual has its own, I think it's called Writing R Extensions, that has a lot of that information, but really in a kind of like hard to find or navigate way. So our packages has a bunch of great information on how to make your R code easy to download and install on any computer. And so what I was missing in my role was, well, what if we don't want to adopt a framework? What if we just want to develop a Shiny app as an R package? And so the book was written just as a, it's that there was a gap in Shiny app development. And actually, this is like, I can go off on a tangent here. So you remember Joe Chang was going to write the Shiny book. And Joe Chang has said this on stage, so I don't feel bad throwing him under the bus here. Joe Chang didn't write the Shiny book. Hadley Wickham wrote the Shiny book. And Hadley Wickham, like, packages are introduced in, I think it's like chapter 19 or 20 of Mastering Shiny. And it should be like, in my opinion, it should be like chapter 2 or 3. Because so much of your development of a Shiny, of a good Shiny application, will be driven by a lot of package development behaviors and tools. So things like loading the code, things like writing tests, that kind of stuff to make sure that your application, especially if you're going into a production environment, it's Shiny app packages basically was, I think I even have like a Venn diagram. It was like, there was this spot missing of, okay, I know how to develop an R package. There's all this great, like how to build a Shiny app, but like, how do I build an R package with a Shiny app that isn't in a framework? I think since there's been, when I wrote it, I think Rhino was like in its infancy. I think it's a little bit bigger now. And Rhino is its own animal, not just literally, but figuratively. It's not a package. So Rhino applications are not packages. They actually use, I don't know, people are familiar, they use box, which is this kind of different, unique way of maintaining dependencies. But
Rhino is more of a framework. It's an
it is, yeah,
opinionated framework. Yeah.
exactly. Yeah,
It helps you use software engineering principles really more
yes,
to do
yes.
what you're doing with your Shiny app development.
And being very, very precise in dependency management and other things. I think that well, it's been, I think it's been used pretty successfully in some of the FDA submissions. So I know that it's great for what it does. I think that what my advice always is for like newcomers is that like it's still worthwhile to learn how to write R packages. It's still worthwhile to learn how to develop Shiny applications. And then once you get to a point where you want to, take out something like Rhino, having that framework to kind of like compare and contrast will just make it easier to learn that. So yeah, I think getting into Shiny, I think there's never been a better time to get into Shiny development because it seems like I see more and more. In fact, just this morning before the call, I was like deep into this. Let me just do a shameless plug for this amazing newsletter from the RDM Weekly on Substack. Is a great newsletter, and they had this fantastic app that is a README builder. So let me just plug everybody else's tools here. Yeah, there's a README builder Shiny app that I was just really fascinated by and was trying to resist the temptation to dig into before I talk because I didn't want to have a bunch of distractions, but
It's okay.
it happened anyway. But yeah, so the Shiny app space seems like it's getting larger every day, and Shiny for Python, like I said, I think is worth learning. I know that there's 2 syntaxes there, so it probably is personal preference on which one you want to learn, but yeah, it's equally as I would say impressive and probably will follow the same kind of adoption trend.
Okay, we have we're gonna get a link in there to the RDM Weekly from Crystal Lewis.
That's who
Maybe
it was. Couldn't
yeah,
remember.
maybe Lauren can help me get that link. I am subscribed to it. Um, so yes, Nathan, there's definitely a link to sign up for that. Crystal is amazing. And I wanted to hop in and just talk about what Shiny is for a second, just in case anybody has not used it. I saw some questions that were kind of filtering through the chat about Shiny. Um, and the questions were tending towards like, oh, it sounds like Shiny app development is more software engineering. But writing a Shiny app, you can write it in R, and that's sort of why it exists, right? So that if you are a data scientist, a data analyst, and you do most of your work in R, you don't have to learn JavaScript and you don't have to learn HTML in order to create something and deploy it that lets you have an interactive app for data science or data analytics purposes, which is amazing. It makes web development, web app development much more accessible for somebody who writes mostly in R or mostly in Python as well. They're Shiny for Python. And Shiny for Python has two different versions because there's an express version and then there's a regular version, which is a lot more like the R syntax. So definitely go explore Shiny because we are making it sound like it's really, really heavy software engineering, but you can make a Shiny app in a few lines of code and have it run and kind of dip your toes in the water. It's really, really amazing and fun. So I put a link to Shiny, but you can Google Shiny apps and get to all kinds of information, including some really easy, like get started, um, a few lines of code, you'll be good to go. And there's a wonderful community online of Shiny people who would be happy to help you and answer your questions. And if you have joined the Discord with our little link in the chat to join the Discord, there's a Shiny channel. Go ask your questions there and hang out there. We would love to see you. Okay, let's head back over to the Slido. Thank you, Nathan, for asking that great question to get us started. And I saw that Noor asked a question that got some replies, and I would love to just put this out there so that anybody in the chat can reply. And Martin, you can reply as well. You had already mentioned a few resources like your book.
Yeah,
Nor, would you like to unmute and ask your question live? And you can even chime in with some replies that were in there if you want, or I can read those.
Sure. Hi, my name is
Hey.
Noor. Thank you for coming to the Hangout, Martin. I don't know why I just said that. Anyway, uh, best way to learn Shiny or best projects to start with, resources are also helpful. I've seen a lot of resources in the chat. Basically, how do I become one of these happy Shiny people?
um, I think I think that yeah. Well, you can be a happy, shiny person right now. Just decide to be. And you seem pretty happy already. But the no, the thing that I am a big fan of. So I started building Shiny apps with pet projects, right? At the time that Shiny came out, Jesus is probably 2015 or 16, and it was still very early. I didn't really know what I could do with it. But I knew I wanted to. I was tired of like developing, um, tables for, research manuscripts and that kind of stuff. So just the idea of being able to put the output from an R program into something that was interactive was really exciting to me. And what I really recommend to people, there's so many great books on. At the time, the reason I brought up the data is at the time, I think analyzing baseball data was like it was like the first edition. I think it was all written in base R. It's since been updated. I think I have like a new third edition coming where it's been converted to tidyverse and stuff. So I highly recommend that book if you're a baseball fan. But there's so many great books on, doing R data analysis in a particular domain, and that like ranges from NFL to I'm going to stick with sports right now because that was like how I got into it. But there are so many. Whatever your flavor of data that you find interesting, you can probably find a book written in R. Libby, you can probably help me out with that. Is it the CRC series?
Well, perhaps CRC Press, yes. I
Yeah.
put Mastering Shiny in the chat, but I
Yes.
wanted to see if I could get the name of the book you were talking about that was written with baseball stuff.
Oh, analyzing baseball data with R. I think Ben.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, Ben Balmer has maybe been on. I think he's been on
I
top.
found it. All right, great.
Yeah,
Thank
and
you.
it's free online too, so you'll find it there. But Ben has been great about updating that book with like the current tidyverse syntax and that kind of stuff, just to make sure that the methods are all good. But so to answer your question, I had a pet project and I got into Shiny because there was like no pressure other than my own curiosity to get an application built. Once I had like a pretty decent understanding, I immediately advertised myself as a um, a freelance, I think I just use freelance app developer, but like a freelance Shiny developer. And one of the first kind of contracts I got was something that was publicly available that I could share was uh, the American Diabetes Association asked me to build a Shiny application for a surveillance error grid analysis. It was like I could probably find it, but the thing, the last time I checked, watch now it's not going to be working, but like I built this thing in like 2017 and it still works. You can still see the original like fluid page. It's by no means, I would say, I don't pull it up when it's like representative of my best work because it's like the first app that I remember building as a freelance Shiny developer. But that app was only possible because I spent a bunch of time learning the inner workings with my pet project, right? So there's a lot to be gained from a curiosity-driven project where there isn't a spec sheet, you don't have deadlines, there aren't stakeholders that are telling you, where to move things and how the UI should look and stuff. So you can really kind of go nuts with the, Chinese features and see, kind of see what you can do. The added benefit doing that you're exploring data that you're interested in. And I think that is kind of the best way to learn it. You can definitely use Mastering Shiny as a resource and all the Shiny reference, but the thing that will really kind of like drive, I would say, your ability or push your abilities as a developer is if you have data that you're interested in and want to explore, because that way, you'll actually make something useful to you. And that's really, at the end of the day, a Shiny developer, any app developer is trying to make something useful to the shareholders or stakeholders of that app.
For sure. Yeah. And there's a question here that is anonymous, so I will ask it. I'll also stick it in the chat here. But I think this is a great one to ask for anybody who is trying to advocate for a tool. It says, how do you get your team to switch to Shiny instead of Tableau? Tableau makes me sad. I will replace Tableau with like any point and click dashboard creation tool. Do you have any tips on advocating for Shiny as a tool?
Yeah,
Or maybe like why it's difficult for leadership to wrap their head around using an open source tool that's code first like Shiny?
yeah, I think the code first is probably the biggest hurdle.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so getting people to write code who don't write code is it's I think you have to really get them to kind of build on I getting them to build on successes. I think that we use the phrase a lot, like let them eat cake first, right? I think that part of the reason that Tableau, Power BI, all these point and click kind of GUI interfaces are so popular is because, for the majority of people using them, they not only have attached in their mind a certain like expediency and a timeline in which these things are built, but they have a mental model for how, like if I want to build a dashboard or I want to, with Tableau, I want to build this thing. I want to have maximum kind of like, what they perceive as I want to be able to customize it, and then I want to be able to share it quickly with whoever's asked for it, right? And I think that for them, the biggest hurdle is I'm going to go from a mental model and process and timeline that I'm vaguely, um, comfortable predicting outcomes with to I'm going to go learn a syntax and a language in which, there's just a total uncertainty on how quickly they'll be able to develop to deliver and develop the same products, the same outcomes. So I think that it kind of takes baby steps in getting them comfortable with doing anything in code versus point and click. And once they can kind of see the ecosystem around like why we use code, the fact that it can be version controlled, the fact that you can collaborate with it, the fact that, no GUI is ever going to be a full language, right? Because language gives us, I'm going to forget, I think it's Wilhelm Volz said about language that it's infinite, kind of outcomes with finite, objects. So it's the fact that a language gives you the ability to literally create kind of anything with endless combinations of its, verbs and grammar. And that's why, no matter how many things you put into a GUI interface, you're still, you have two clicks with a mouse, right? That's all you can do is click or not, right? And the fact that you have a language, like ggplot2 is a per example of not only is it a full grammar of how to build beautiful visualizations, but the more you use ggplot2, the more you can pick up any graph or look at any chart and understand it better. because you have a language of understanding graphs that you didn't have prior to programming with that syntax. And, computer programming languages are the same way, when it comes, R has its origin in statistics, and it isn't long before you're doing statistics with R that, the programming in many ways complements your statistical knowledge, right? So the two kind of go hand in hand. And I think that when it comes to getting people to switch over to a syntax-based tool, it's just them kind of unlocking the ability of the language versus, kind of resisting that, that point and click, which, like you said, most of the time it's based around, wherever you're working, that organization has timelines and expectations for, I want a dashboard and I want to, with these particular features. And the person who's delivering it in Power BI or Tableau, like I said, they can confidently deliver something within that timeline. And so the opportunity cost of giving up a known tool with timeline, even though it doesn't have some of the features that we know that like Shiny would have, it's going to an unknown both with the syntax and with the actual application.
Awesome. Thank you. And I wanted to call out something that Renato had said in the chat. He says you don't even have to deploy a Shiny app for it to be useful. You can hit play locally and have it do things for you with the push of a button. This is often how I use Shiny apps. I'm like, I need to do a thing that would be so much quicker if I could interactively be fed things and click through them, right? Like I could verify something, put it in one category or the other. It's easier for me to do that with my eyeballs than to go through and go through like a list or put it in a spreadsheet. So I'll just build something that I will literally never use again, but it will be useful for me in the moment. So there are ways to play with Shiny apps and use them that are not even, you don't need to deploy them for any reason. They can just be for you. Gonzalo says there's a play button. Yeah, you can press play on your Shiny app. Depends on what UI you're using. You can also just run a Shiny App function and it will run for you. Well, I have a question here from Arsenis in Slido. Arsenis, would you like to ask your question live? I will highlight it at the top and I will also put it into the chat.
Yeah, sure, Libby. Thanks. And Martin, thanks for taking the time and chatting with us today. I've basically decided to come in with a bit of a technical question. As a fellow lover of Shiny or somebody who enjoys kind of playing with it and doing stuff, I have a question about modules. So when I write code in R, which is what I write primarily in, I love writing functions. I love vectorizing things, generalizing my code as much as I can, but I can't seem to wrap my mind around modules, even though I do have a pretty solid basic understanding of reactivity. So I'm wondering if you might explain modules like I'm five.
Yeah, modules are to your Shiny app what your folder directory is like in your operating system. So the best way to think about modules is that when you create another namespace, it's really not that complicated. It just appends the name of that namespace into the application's like reactive model. So when the simplest is like if you have some input module and then some output module that has a graph, right? And so you're collecting like 3 drop down, inputs with this input module, and you're shooting it over, to your graphing function into the output. So namespace collision is what you're trying to avoid with modules, right? Because it's all one namespace with just an app.r file. And when you append a namespace, it is just literally it's like, what's the string function where you're pasting together the name of the namespace into the output, right? So your input IDs, let's say you have input X, Y, and Z, and you have a module that's inputs, becomes inputs dash X, input stack Y, input stack Z. And the reason that you have these, these appended namespaces, it's back to the folder and directory, is that you can't have 2 folders with the same name in the same directory, right? You can't, in your root directory, you can't have like 2 homes. You can't have 2 folders with the same name in the same space. The same thing with namespace collision, right? If you have inputs and you are like me, you don't have original names for all of your inputs, you will eventually have namespace collision because the namespace is shared without modules throughout the whole application. by adding the namespace function and then the module, the two functions work together. Namespace just really appends the name of the module in the UI, and then in the server, you see that it has like it has the same syntax that you would have in a regular server function, right? But it's just reading from the UI from that particular module that particular input. So it's really just appending a bunch of like, you know, prefixes to your inputs, so that way you don't have any namespace collision.
I think of it as like naming your children different things, but I'll have the same last name.
Yeah, exactly. No, you're
I
absolutely right.
understand the namespace thing, but what is a module?
A module is just a small piece of interactive code, usually accompanied with it's like a mini UI server combination, right?
Yeah.
Oh,
Self-contained. So it's like a Lego piece. Like if you're building a
So
Lego wall,
that's
bricks.
the thing is I'm drawing a blank too because I use them so often. It's NS and then you have module server. Doesn't it read? I can't remember the name of the function inside the server. But those two things function like your regular UI and server, but just on a smaller, more modular level, right? So, and you can nest modules, but all that does again is just like another subfolder, right? Or in Libby's example, it's just a middle name, right? Where you're further identifying that particular input, you know,
so you're basically creating kind of like you're creating a small container that has both client and server reactivity kind of contained within it.
yes.
And then because of the namespace thing, it's then reusable.
Yes. And so
Okay, so
you'll have like your inputs that can then be just read out of your module and then fed into your outputs module.
that's the piece I was missing, is that it's both in one
Yes.
thing.
So yeah, you have a UI and server component in each module that function just like your regular when you build a you know an app.r file, just your standard boilerplate that function the same way a UI and server call work there. You're just basically making it much more, you know, the biggest benefit to using them is just that it mentally chunks a component of the app into like, I'm now only dealing with these inputs and how they're returned. Or
Very
depending
cool.
on how you design it, it can be like, I'm only dealing with this input and the output it creates, right? It really, module design is kind of up to the individual programmer, and the patterns are just, you know, preference. But the simplest example that I always think of is the like you have a module for inputs, a module for outputs. The input module will return all the outputs, and then in the main server, you'll collect those inputs and pass them into the server of the output module.
Yeah. And
Got
what's
it.
great is that it's just like writing functions, right? Like you don't want to repeat yourself. You don't want to write the same piece of code for
Yep.
your UI and Shiny like just over and over again. And you're like, oh, well, I'm doing the same thing on this other tab that I did over there twice. Just make it a module, use that same module and just change the input or output that you need. And like Martin said, like collect those inputs and outputs in whatever other module you're using
Yeah.
for the output. But yeah, I think that this is a great conversation. If you're interested in modules, there are a couple of great talks by Deepsha Mengani that are recorded that are out there. Look up modules, Deepsha Mengani, and I will try to get some links in the chat for those as well. She does a great job of helping to explain.
Yeah,
All
and
right,
actually,
amazing.
I would say too, because this is like I always when you're debugging modules, because the first thing that you're gonna wonder like okay, so what does this look like floating around in my namespace? There's a really handy tool, and I do this all the time when I'm dealing with an application that has a lot of modules or nested modules. There is a reactive values to list function in Shiny, and what you can do is you can just drop that into like a render, not render text, a render print, and then a verbatim text output, just anywhere in your UI. You know, usually at the top level. So like right at the top of the app.ui, or the app.r. Sorry, UI.r. I forgot we don't do that anymore. It's all app.r now. But it's in your UI. You're going to just drop a verbatim text output, and then somewhere, you know, down the server, just do a render print of the reactive values to list, right? Just assign it to an object, spit it out in the UI. And what that does is it actually gives you a very clear idea of like how the namespacing works, because you'll see those appended names of the module to the actual input ID or output ID. So you can actually see all of your reactives in real time without like shutting down your app or trying to use the debugger. You can just basically spit out the reactive values right at the UI and look at them as you're changing them and moving around.
Awesome. All right. Thank you so much, Arsenis, for that great question. We had a question that came through that was anonymous that says, I'm curious to know what's on your Posit wish list. This is a Posit employee and me in here asking anonymous questions. Um, as a person who uses a lot of Shiny, is there anything that you wish that it could do that it doesn't do, or that any of the products you use could do?
Yeah, I actually I erased my doodles because I'm insecure about my artistic talent or lack thereof. Yeah, it
Oh, on
was
the board behind you?
yeah, the board behind me, my pos it was actually so well, Libby and I just spoke about before this. I was wondering, so that's my questions for like Posit developers that are building stuff that I'm using. So my question was related to the great series of packages actually written by Simon Couch, who wrote, it was originally PAL, and now I think it's Chores, Gander,
Yeah.
and he didn't. Oh, and then I think Ensure is the other one. So he has a collection of LLM tools, and yeah, I think there was actually just a bunch of chicken scratches and then a big question of like, what is this? Because I was wondering whether like chores could be classified as, is it a skill? Is it a tool? How would you um how would you like in kind of like Claude Anthropic parlance, how would you um categorize what's being created with a chores helper? And he answered that. So yeah, what I was comfortable deleting it along with my artwork. But yeah, usually that's so the wish list is always something that I'm using, either like, within Positron or RStudio that I have questions about, or is this coming soon? Um, is the biggest thing that you guys actually did um, release was the assistant pane in our studio IDE. I was wondering when that was going to be released, as some kind of equivalent to Positron assistant. And now that's out. And I think is that shipping the preview, or is that in the regular R Studio download now?
That's a good question because it was just recently, but I think that it is available. And that is Posit Assistant
Yes.
as opposed to Positron Assistant. I know all the names are so similar,
I
you
know
guys.
it's
So
getting
I'm
me.
like this.
Yeah.
I'm so
And
sorry. We all just blame Joe Chang and he takes the responsibility. We
no, it's
just
like, and then there's like Posit AI. And now I have this other word that just fits in there, but there's Posit Assistant, which works via Posit AI subscription in
yes,
your
yeah.
RStudio IDE. And then there's Positron Assistant, which is configured into Positron, not to be confused with Databot. That's another thing.
Not to be confused with Databot. And I think that all of these things will shake themselves out. The thing is, innovation with AI happens so quickly that things change, in 6 months, everything will be completely different. And so I think naming conventions have been a difficult thing. Naming things is the hardest part of data science. We all know this, right? So we forgive Joe Chang
Yeah,
all
and
the wonderful
also, yeah,
things that he's inventing. The
yeah,
naming
and
is hard.
relates back to the namespacing problem. Is that you
Yes,
run out of names for things in your namespace, and that's
everything comes back to naming things. Well, I think that Chores is amazing. I stuck a link to Chores and also pasted the hex image in there because I think that little potato, it's just so cute. I think of him as Pal still because it was named Pal to begin with.
that was.
Um,
But I also have to do, because I brought up time, I have to do a shameless plug for the BTW package because it's I think Garrett is
yeah.
actually working on that. If you're
Yes,
doing any
Garrett
kind of
Gaden Bowie.
yeah, and that actually is just such a great reading through the documentation on like the BTW package itself, not just using it in your development, but it's like a master class in skills and and tools. It's a really really great package. The source code for it is amazing. Garrick, yeah,
Okay, sweet. We put a link in there. Somebody else helped me out with that as well. So thank you for our faithful link posters in the chat. And I saw a great question from Renato. Renato, do you want to ask your question live? I'm going to highlight it in Slido so it pops to the top so you can see it. And then I'm also going to put that in the chat. see you. Can I hear you? No,
Ah,
I can't hear you. Dang it. I see you talking, but I can't hear you. Okay, I will ask your question for you, but we'll pretend that this is Renato talking. Renato says, how do your journalism interests interact with your shiny work?
yeah, so this is just more about like my personal path into this field, which everyone wants once they get to a position, it always sounds very linear when people describe like how they ended up. But I want to be the first to acknowledge that I fell into data science. I started off, and this gets back. I promise this isn't a tangent. This goes back to journalism. Um, I started off with I was going to school for exercise science, so I thought I was going to be a sports medicine, MD. But when I got out of undergrad, that was the Great Recession, the previous recession. So, it was difficult to kind of like find somewhere to work while you're studying for the MCAT. So some professor who was great, looking out for me said, you should jump into, get your master's in exercise science because you already had a bachelor's and, there's kind of nothing out there right now. And I took his advice. So that was the first one that wasn't my idea. And then the jobs that were available for a research assistant, that's a graduate student, one of them was a research associate, and I needed to get some, we had grant sponsored projects that I worked on, and I needed to get some R scripts to run. So that was, I learned R out of necessity. It wasn't as soon as, of course, I found our community, then I loved it. But I didn't do like what am I going to do with my career? I think I'm going to get into data science decision. That was never a decision I made. So fast forward to I'm now wanting to go, into some analytic field. And at the time, data science was a thing, but there weren't really that many programs. So this was like 2015 or so. And UCSF had a master's in clinical research, and Berkeley was like talking about a data science program. And I was in the Bay Area, same reason everybody goes there for, I was going to work at a startup and, go public and get rich. Didn't, never worked. But the thing is, it was more that I didn't want to wait around for a data science program. So I jumped into UCSF's clinical research. And that's really how I ended up in the biotech pharma space, right? So it was like, all of these were, they look like decisions on a CV, but it was external forces kind of life batting me around into certain, areas more than an active decision. Journalism was, I had a friend who I met that I'll go ahead and name him by, he'd be great to have on this. Elishu Bejak is his name. He and I wrote together at the journalism story bench blog, and then he's gone on to work at USA Today, and he was at Urban Institute for a while. I'm not exactly sure where he is now, but the trade was I was going to show him how to use R, and he was going to improve my writing. Because if you've ever been in a graduate program, you spend a lot of time writing, articles or peer-reviewed research that I hate to break your heart, like no one wants to read. They're all written in passive voice. They're all very dry. There's a reason why nobody other than other academics read it. So I went to him like desperately looking to improve my writing so people would actually want to read what I wrote. And so I think that one of the things, one of the myths you're told is like, oh, the data speaks for itself. You just show them the data. And I think that is journalism students and people that are skilled with communication know that, you're really you're working toward making sure your audience is engaged and that you're getting them information clearly and concisely, and that is something that I think when you're trained academically for writing, it's almost like volume equals quality. And I think that, it's good to have somebody who really, especially nowadays, just in terms of time and economy, somebody that can help you get your writing down to a level where you can be clear and concise without removing the important bits. And so journalism was just one of the ways that I really wanted to improve my communication, not just in writing, but because so much of what I do is technical writing. I wanted my technical writing to also be very clear and concise and written to where, a wide audience could read it and understand what was out of it.
Amazing. You're in good company. If you are not looking at the chat, there are a bunch of people going, I was in X field, fell into data science from there, right? Like nobody,
Yeah.
nobody is like linear pathway, yep, straight to data science. We all come from different places. I see zoology, I see biostats, I see biomedical science. There are so many pathways. And then I see one person, I think it was Gonzalo, said, I tried to get into data science and then fell into being an AI engineer. Sometimes the squiggly pathways might start at data science and go somewhere else.
Yeah, I
That
think
was
that
awesome.
honestly, the most interesting, people that the most interesting career paths, it really isn't a like plan. It's this accumulation of unique skills that make them, you know, particularly well fit for a type of problem. And, it's that unique combination of skills that make you valuable to, to any organization or any field. It's not, checking boxes along the way. I mean, I also think that, there's a great book written about this called Range by David Epstein. And it was like a follow-up to
Oh,
Malcolm
yeah.
Gladwell's
I haven't
10,000
had that book.
Hours. Yeah, it's a phenomenal book that really points out that like, we put such an emphasis, especially in technical fields, on expertise. And I'm more of a fan of good enough than I am of expertise. I think that good enough, meaning good enough knowledge to get work done, good enough knowledge to get where you need to be is so much more valuable than expertise. Being an expert in something, we need experts, absolutely. I'm not denying we need experts, but we don't need everyone to be an expert, right? We need more people that have good enough knowledge in a variety of fields than we need, a whole bunch of people who are highly specified in one area. I really think
Right.
that, yeah, general knowledge, good enough knowledge, and I think this will just become increasingly true with, all the technological advances or changes we see coming, is that, the what I've seen thus far with the LM tools is that your knowledge around the data science tech stack is going to be much more desirable than any particular programming language. You'll still need to know the language, but
Right.
implementing these, across, the technology that is in your ecosystem that you work with is going to require knowledge of things outside just your programming language.
I love that. And you also, I think that having knowledge of multiple things helps you develop empathy around the things that other people are dealing with that are adjacent to you. And that empathy is very, very important. It also helps you develop your thinking skills so that when someone asks you a case study type question, when they're like, how would you tackle this? And it's something you've never tackled before, you have all of these adjacent experiences that let you sort of extrapolate how you would tackle that thing that you've never done before. And that's sort of a superpower. I wanted to show everybody what range looks like. It's right here. Most of the books we talk about are on my shelf, but my shelf is like really long that way. But it happened to be right next to me. So I'm like, I'm going to grab it and let you know what it looks like by David Epstein here. Um, okay. This is a fantastic question that follows into Neil's question that Neil asked in Slido. So I would love to read that one. Neil has an asterisk, so I'm going to read it for him. Um, and it says, data analysts are increasingly being asked to use R and Shiny. Many can write code that works in the short term, but struggle to build code that stays reliable and maintainable as projects become more complex. So, what advice would you give analysts who want to improve their code quality as they grow?
Yeah, this kind of, I think this is just part of the nature of open source, is that, it is always fun to use the developer written packages from GitHub and that kind of stuff. And I mean, I've been just as frustrated as anybody when like your dplyr code suddenly doesn't work because of some, change in the syntax. Like, that this is kind of the nature of open source tooling, that these things evolve and change over time. And so stability, um, base R is more your friend than you realize. I think people underestimate, how important base R is. to doing a lot of, I would say just regular programming. I haven't had many problems with Shiny itself in terms of being unstable. They're really good about backwards compatibility. But, I always explain to developers that, that I'm either supervising or working with that, look, the more that you go out on that edge of, this is under development, under active development, the further that you kind of push the boundary, that it comes at a cost of probably additional maintenance. And I think that maintenance is actually, there used to be that data wrangling was the thing that like nobody wanted to talk about for statisticians. So, like how much time do you actually spend cleaning the data versus like analyzing the data? And it was like an 80-20. But nobody likes like, I think the term data wrangler actually sounds pretty cool, but nobody wanted to go, everybody wanted to be a data scientist. But no, I think that the maintenance of the applications that are developed in open source is just a part of the cost of doing business. And I think we parse that in enough. I think that it should be part of an expectation that if you're using something that is if you're using, bleeding edge, cutting edge stuff, it's like building a Ferrari. It's going to perform really well, but you're going to have to provide a lot of maintenance to make sure it performs. You can scale it back quite a bit and use, only CRAN packages and increasingly depend on base R for stability if that is your primary concern. Those are trade-offs you have to accept with open source tools.
I will add to this by saying the hardest time I've ever had maintaining a Shiny app, because I have been a Shiny developer actually for a short time, and I've done freelance work as Shiny developer. The hardest job I ever have is when a Shiny app was built using non-CRAN packages that were not versioned and are just living on some random person's GitHub repo that made a package one time and then never touched it again. So my plea to the universe is if you are building a production grade Shiny app, you're deploying it for somebody, you're doing something for freelance work or otherwise, please, please, please try to stick to vetted and versioned packages that are on CRAN and that will stick around. Otherwise, people are not going to be able to restore or build back to your version, especially if they're built on our end. All right, that's my piece. I don't know if you have any follow on to that, Martin, but
No, that's
that's the
exactly, yeah, that's really what I was getting at, was just that, that there are really great development, developer built packages that are adding, I would say quality and features to your application that I would say, are essential, but because they're not on CRAN, they can also be one of those things that maybe contact that author, see what their, plan is for that package. And I don't know how many of them, but I do think that, if you said, hey, I want to make sure this lasts in the future, I can't imagine a developer saying, no, by all means, don't commit my package to CRAN. Don't,
right. Yeah.
become a co-author to that package if it's valuable to you and make sure it ends up on CRAN and
But
your problem's
like
resolved.
Martin said, like base R is so much more powerful than you think it is, and having fewer dependencies because you did something in base R instead of depending on a package to do something can be really, really powerful. You can
It
cut
is.
down your
Yeah.
dependencies. Yeah. I've definitely been guilty of like looking at a package and being like, oh, I can do that in base R. I'm just going to replace that function with a little bit of base R and I still get the functionality without needing a dependency. Okay, well, we have time for one more question because we have about 6 minutes left. And I think that you already answered our favorite question, which is a career advice question, by talking about range and being a generalist. So let's see. Mike Smith, I believe you had a question. I lost it. It's jumping around. I found it. I'm going to put that in the chat, and it has an asterisk next to it, which mics don't normally, but I get to I get to ask a mic question for him. Okay, I just put it in the chat for everybody. It says the Venn diagram of DS, data science programmer, Shiny app developer, and IT org app developer has a lot of overlap. But do you think there are any practices from IT org developer that we could learn from a data science programmer, Shiny app developer perspective? This is a great question for Martin because he actually spent years as a Posit admin, sort of in a behind the scenes role, but was still developing Shiny apps from that direction. So you've dealt with this from both sides.
Yeah, I will say I was frustrated because things Shiny apps as a Shiny app developer, I built something and then I'd run into that wall of like can't get into production, can't deploy it, right? So the DevOps kind of wall. And then I just decided you know what? wonder what the problem is. So then I went over to the posit system admin side and realized it's much more complicated than I thought it was, like most things. So I think that, the biggest solution to this is exactly what Libby said, and that's, you know, understanding more of what IT does and really, asking them to go through, you know, to the degree that they will let you. Some organizations have a very high wall between IT and developers, and others are, they're able to get in a call and talk through. But understanding how these services like Connect and Workbench and Package Manager are set up in your organization, understanding how they're configured, understanding what maintenance of the services looks like. One of the first things that I did as a positive system admin, because I'm a Shiny app developer, was like, all right, obviously a huge part of this job is looking at log files. It's just a ton of grepping on these log files. And Shiny has this amazing reactive file reader that I just built a really simple Shiny application that I could select the log file from the UI and just spit the log into the app, and then I could search for that instead of having to do it in the terminal, right? So it's, and believe me, that's one of those things that unless they're really diehard, some people are diehard terminal users and you're never going to change your mind. But if you can see what IT deals with and what they do, I think a lot of times, and approach it from hey, I just want to understand, not selfishly, I want to understand what the problem is so I can get my stuff deployed, but just understand the difficulties that they deal with from a services and architecture standpoint. It'll help you when you're deploying to think about okay, what resources is this going to take up in terms of what's on the server, what additional kind of firewall issues, what networking issues might I run into with this application that IT is going to say no to or need approval for. I think that just a little bit of understanding of this admin role and responsibilities makes you a much better app developer, just in terms of that final 10% of getting it into production. Yeah, and then of course, taking skills back and forth. Yeah, I definitely have a different understanding of deploying applications after having worked as a system admin, and the dependencies and stuff that are required, from command line dependencies that they need to install so that I can use these R packages, because the tools are required on the server itself long before the R package will be able to access it.
Yeah, it helps you with the why can't you just problem,
Oh, yeah.
because nobody wants to hear why can't you just XYZ, because you are
Yeah,
not seeing clearly their struggles.
I have a basic rule about not ever ask. So anybody I work with, I just avoid a just question,
Yeah,
because I assume everyone I work with, all of the just questions have been tried and answered, right? So if I find
yeah,
myself thinking, why don't you just, I immediately, they've tried that. They've already done that. If it was a just
probably, yeah.
solution, it would have been tried, right? So
You
we're
can come
now,
at it with curiosity from a different angle and learn
exactly.
instead
Yeah.
of accusing. Well,
Yeah.
we have reached 1 minute to top the hour, so I feel like we must say goodbye. This was very, very fun. There are so many questions that didn't get answered in Slido. They're so good. There were two. There's one from Adam and one from Jackie that were both sort of about testing, which I think were really great. Martin, I will get you the unanswered questions afterwards so that you can see them, and you can feel free to answer them or not if you want in Slido. But this was really fun. I hope you had a good time. Thank you so much for coming.
Of course, yeah. And I will answer them either in Slido, or maybe I'll put an answer in the LinkedIn post or something, so that way it's accessible for the questions that didn't get answered.
Amazing. We'll see if we can convince Martin to join the Discord too, maybe. No, no
Yeah.
promises.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, thank you everybody. This was really fun. I hope that all of your shiny dreams came true today and that you learned a lot. Shiny is one of my favorite topics. We always love hanging out with you. We will see you next week. Have a fantastic weekend. And yeah, I'm going to give everybody just a second more to save the chat if they want to. The chat is full of resources, but when this video ends up on YouTube, All of those resources are going to be linked in the description. If you are ever watching our YouTube videos later, go click that description button to make it bigger and you will see links galore. And you also see timestamps and stuff for every question. We love hanging out with you. Have a fantastic and safe weekend. Goodbye, everybody.